Hi, eighth graders. It's Ms. Decker here today with you. Before we get started on our poem for today, I wanted to just remind you of our daily responsibilities. 30 minutes independent reading, tracking however you want, making sure that you have pages in your book, title of your book, and how long that you read. Our 30 minutes of journaling every day with the link to the instructions there. And then we'll get started on our author's craft work again here very shortly. Here's our emails if you need us. So the last 2 days, we've been focusing on poetry, and we're going to continue that today. Tomorrow, we'll take a little bit of a break from that. We'll have two videos from you from kind of some guest teachers. Ms. Camrad and Ms. Johnson will be working with us, or they've worked with us and they've submitted some videos for you to watch as well. And then Friday, we have some exciting stuff as well. So on Friday, I'll put this on the assignment sheet as well. But on Friday, we're going to have meetups via Zoom. So Ms. Tresick and Mr. Dickinson and I will all be on Zoom and ready to talk with you about some different things. We'll put those expectations on that assignment sheet as well on the website. But basically, if you are in an advanced section, so advanced language arts students, your meetup time is 9 a.m. And then if you are in any language arts class in 8th grade, you are then meeting up at 10 a.m. with the three of us. So those are the login times. We will send you those links tomorrow so you can get prepared for that, but be ready. We want to see as many faces as possible. Just one, we want to see you, and two, it'll be a great chance for us to talk about some of the work that you've been doing in your notebooks. We'll also have two Flipgrids on Friday, one for your journal and one is a weekly review of our text analysis discussion that we've had either via Flipgrid, in your notebook, or anything that you want to talk about. So there'll be some ways for you to prepare. And like I said, we'll post those expectations tomorrow in the assignment document that we've been using to house all of our instructions. So if you have any questions about the Zoom meetup, any questions about those links, you might have to download something. I think you should be okay. You shouldn't have to create an account. I've used Zoom without creating an account before. So maybe test it out a little bit before Friday's meetup. And like I said, those links will be posted for you. All right, so let's get started for today. So if we look, we've now have a long list of craft moves and literary devices that we've talked about over the course of the last 7 lessons or 6 lessons. Dialogue, imagery, symbolism, exposition, foreshadowing, conflict, motif, building empathy, mood, tone, metaphor. And now we've also started to introduce some new poetry terms. If you're still unfamiliar or you're still kind of confused even after our explanations, I encourage you to move beyond just these videos and do some research outside of that, where you're looking at rhyme and scheme and stanza and rhythm. We're also I'm going to touch on some of those things today, but I'm also going to focus on the pattern of the text that we're looking at today, mood, and personal connections to the text. And we'll talk a little bit about, I didn't jot this down, but we will talk about how time moves in the poem that we are looking at today. So log on to Common Lit, and we are going to be reading The Listener. And so this poem is assigned for you by your teachers in Common Lit. So let's go ahead and get started. First, I want to say this is by a gentleman named Alan King. It was written very recently in 2017. He's a Caribbean American, and this poem is dedicated and about his deceased aunt. And so her name is Marilyn King, but her nickname was Mops, and she died in 2009. So I'm going to read the whole thing through, and then I'm going to go back and pick certain parts that I want to talk about. So we're going to start right from the beginning, right here at paragraph 1. It says, "A woman in the next aisle laughs among the milk and orange juice. Laughter stops, the words in her throat, so no matter what, they won't finish the joke. She laughs like my Aunt Mops. The one who was ready to drive from D.C. to Baltimore to scorch my boss with her fire bottle words when I told her when I made as a reporter, forced to work weekends. She got her nickname Mops from the Mopsy biscuit she loved as a girl back in Trinidad. Every Friday, I'd snatch a stack of newspapers from my job and race down to her house, where the aromas of pound cake and curry fought each other like siblings. I'd drop off a few copies at her salon. She'd smile, see how my nephew all over the front page. So she'd keep a paper to read my articles on city council corruption and displaced East Baltimore residents before she fell asleep. If I was stressed from work, she'd always say, "Them can't pay Slater and frayed powder." When she died from cancer, I thought I lost her forever. But she's an aisle over, laughing, behind the spice shelf. So, that poem is very different from the poems that we read the last 2 days, from Hope is a Thing with Feathers and I Walk Lonely as a Cloud. One of the first things I noticed as a difference is this idea of rhyme scheme. There really isn't a rhyme scheme in this poem. There was kind of at the beginning in the second paragraph where it said like I kind of got caught up on it, where it's like laughter stops the words in her throat and joke. And like, so those words don't really rhyme, but they have that same long like O sound. So I noticed that when I was reading. I didn't notice it the first time, but I noticed it when I was reading it aloud right now. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but if we look through the rest of the poem, there's really no rhyme scheme, especially not like the one that Ms. Tresick featured in on the first day, right? This AB, and then I think Mr. Dickinson's poem, the I Walk Lonely as a Cloud, was like ABCC, and this poem doesn't follow any formal pattern. And if we also look, these stanzas are different sizes. So that's one thing that I would note. And I would think to myself, like, why would the author want to create a poem where like the stanzas aren't the same length and there isn't really a visible pattern? I wrote this down. So it's in my notebook, I wrote down that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different stanzas, and they follow the pattern of 3-line, 3-line, 5-line, 3-line, 5-line, 6-line, 2-line, 2-line, 3-line. And if I look just visually at this poem, it almost creates like a triangle. Like if you think, it almost kind of juts out here, and you have your longest longest stanza right here, almost a paragraph, longest stanza, and then it kind of cuts back in as far as like how long like the line length is, and then just itself the different stanzas. And so obviously I don't know the author, but I have to think that that's intentional, that it almost kind of builds. So it starts short and then it starts to move. And then when we get the biggest chunk of our story, where he talks about dropping off the newspapers and every Friday, that's the meat of the story. So it's the biggest interaction with the aunt, right? She even has a line from her, two different spots, right? Look at my nephew all over the front page, and then them can't pay Sailor and frayed powder. And so, though that's kind of the biggest part, and so those tend to be the largest stanzas. Another thing that I think was really important to mention is the way time moves. In the other 2 poems that we read this week, time moves forward. And I was talking to Mr. Dickinson and Ms. Tresick yesterday, and the idea of time came up. And we talked a little bit about how a lot of the poems that we read oftentimes just move very much in chronological order, or they tell a story from start to finish where time doesn't move. This truly has a flashback, right? We start and our author, Alan King, is in the grocery aisle, right? He's in the grocery store, and right next, or in the aisle over, there's a woman who's laughing, right? And it all of a sudden triggers this memory of his Aunt Mops, or his Marilyn King, his aunt. And then we flash back in time, right? The one who was ready to drive from DC to Baltimore, I'm on line 6-7. The one who was ready to drive from DC to Baltimore to scorch my boss with her fire bottle words when I told her that what I made as a reporter for Story Weekends. She got her nickname. So, and then it talks about her as a child, right? And then it goes back into a very specific section of time where every Friday I would do this. And then as we end, we come back here to where the author tells us that she passed away and that he thought he lost her forever, right? And we're back in the aisle. And I think that's a really cool thing. We've talked a little in my class just about how things sometimes like trigger different memories or moments, and like even just a smell can put you back in a moment. Like for me, when I smell like apple pie, like it puts me back in my mom's kitchen. She makes this really like amazing like brown bag apple pie that she puts in the oven. And funny enough, she actually made it this week while we've been, kind of in quarantine. And it brought me back to like being a little kid in our kitchen when, when we lived in Centerville and when I was still in school. And so for this person, this personal connection, right? So if we're thinking about personal connections, they heard someone laugh. And it brought back all of these memories that were good about someone who had died. And this idea that, are they truly lost forever, or do they live in our memories? And I think that's what they're getting at. I think that's what Alan King's getting at. And I don't know this, but my interpretation is that the writing is telling us that, people aren't lost forever. They're all around us. And I thought that was really interesting. And then if we think about, again, just some comparisons to the text from earlier in the week, Hope is a Thing with Feathers is a very short poem, and it's kind of uplifting, right? It has that rhyme scheme, and yesterday's poem has that rhyme scheme, and it really kind of gives you that sing-songy, almost like childlike thought. And so when a poem rhymes, for me, it often has a mood or a tone that is more on the more joyful or happier side. And when a poem doesn't rhyme, I feel like I have to really fish and look for that. And so, and again, this is my interpretation. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, Miss Tracy and Mr. Dickinson and I, and this idea that like rhyme schemes have such an effect on mood, and that was really interesting because we'd never really thought of that before. And then Mr. Dickinson brought that up, and I hadn't really either. But then I took a step back and I was like, yeah, when I think about poetry and that it has a rhyme scheme, it is more joyful. It's almost childlike in some ways. And this poem doesn't have that. And so I think it tends to have a more serious tone, one almost of nostalgia, because our author is remembering things. And so it isn't necessarily joyful. Someone passed away, and it's not that they're not remembering them in happy times, but it is something that is difficult when someone passes away. And so I think the lack of rhyme scheme obviously is very intentional here, and that it is supposed to be a more somber poem. But in the end, we have this little bit of closure, I think, because it bookends. If you look at the top here, it says in the first stanza, it says a woman in the next aisle laughs among the milk and orange juice. And then if we scroll down to the bottom, in the last stanza number 9, it says, but she's an aisle over, laughing behind the spice shelf. Right. And so it kind of has these little like bookends. And so what I was talking with earlier, if you could see me, I'm motioning my hands like crazy right now. It's kind of like this, these sweet little bookends to this poem that kind of, draws larger and larger, like the lines get longer and the stanzas get longer. And then it kind of cuts back into this small stanza. Right. And laughing is its own line in a stanza. And this one, laughs among the milk, it's not. And so I think that's interesting that the author chose to have laughing as its own stanza. And then if we look back up here, that's the only time that happens, I think. Yeah, this is the only spot in the text where one single word is all on its own. And so I think that has to be intentional, this idea of laughing. Oh my gosh, my mouse is going crazy now. And so that's my interpretation of this poem, The Listener. There are so many other things. There's metaphors in here and analogies and personification. I even caught personification on this time when I was reading. And so there's lots of things for you to write about. Please, please, please take one of those things, right? If we think about our instructions for today, right? Go back in and reread. This is like the 5th time I've read this poem and I saw new things that I hadn't seen before. So make sure that you're rereading and you're looking at those craft moves. And remember, our focus today, that's Mystery 6, I'm sorry. This is ours today. But our focus today was the idea of pattern, mood, personal connections to text. You don't have to talk about those, 3 things. We also talked about how time moved, talked about comparisons to other text. And so be free to talk about any of these different things when you go into your notebook today, right? So for the listener, so read the poem multiple times if needed, slow down, right? Also think about ways you can compare this poem to another poem from earlier this week, or just a poem in general that you've read. One of my favorite poems is Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. I'm going to link that for you as well, because it's just one of my favorites. And then record your thinking in your notebook. And a reminder, last thing I want to leave you with is this idea of not the idea, but the plan for our Zoom meetups. We've nailed down some times here for you on Friday. And don't forget about our Flipgrids. Your Flipgrids were awesome. So we want to see even more of you doing that. So I hope you guys have a great day and have fun reading this poem, The Listener.